Hello. So today we're going to cover implicit bias and really start to understand the role that our unconscious plays in how we view others. And then hopefully with that understanding, we can move from implicit bias and unconscious bias to what we would consider critical consciousness. To begin, in the prepare section, make sure that you have filled out your trusted 10. And so what you want to do is you want to list the top 10 people that you trust the most in the left-hand column and just focus on that left-hand column alone. So I'll just give you a minute. You can pause the video and make sure you fill out that left-hand column. Again, the top 10 people that you trust the most, people that you would share your secrets with or you share your personal life with that are very close to you. If you can't come up with 10, that's fine. Try to get like 5 to 10 people. Again, go ahead and pause if you need to. Okay, so now that you have filled out your trusted 10, you can go ahead and fill out the remainder part of the document, which looks at race, age, all kinds of other social factors that define our identity. And what I'd like you to see if there are any patterns that you might notice, especially for this class in the area of race and ethnicity. So for most people, when it comes to our circles of trust, our trusted 10 usually are very similar to us. They usually live in the same area, they have the same social class, religion sometimes, even gender. That's really common that with our core group of people, they tend to have the most in common. And then as you kind of go outside the circle of trust, so you say the friendly people that you know, people that you talk to but aren't super close to, you know their names, but you might not be sharing intimate details with them. And then as you go outwards would be strangers, people that you might know, but you don't know their name, you've seen them around, or maybe you haven't. And so as you notice the centers as they go out, there's going to be increased diversity among those people. So that you may not share as much in common in terms of your race, your gender, your social class and all those things. And that's in fact really common. And so I think part of implicit bias is just being aware of the fact that we tend to surround ourselves with people like us. And I think that's just like a first sort of like starting point to really have this discussion around implicit bias. So the other activity we're going to do in this video is just sort of look at colors and just see how fast we can go in terms of identifying the color. So as you're watching the video, as I go from one slide to the next, just name the color that you see. So we're going to start now. So again, as you follow the slides, name the color that you see. As quick as you can. So I think in that last exercise, you might have been struggling a little bit with the last few slides because the color was different than the color that you would expect to see. And so that's another example. Here we're thinking about how the brain really works and the quick sort of assessments that we make. The implicit or unconscious bias, it's just that it's decisions and ways that we interact where we make a quick assumption and it may or may not be correct. And so implicit bias really helps us to understand how that shapes the way that we think, but more importantly, maybe to change the way that we think. So hopefully these exercises, at least initially, get you to think about what implicit bias is and how it might be connected to your experiences with race and racism. So the next part of this video is a series of images. And these were public images, things that you would see out and about. And so as I go through each image, you'll want to ask yourself these 4 questions. What do you see in this image? Do you think this image relates to race, privilege, and implicit bias? Why or why not? And do you think this image shows an explicit or implicit bias towards or against a particular group? And if you see this in public, would you have noticed inequities in this image? So we're going to go through each of these pictures here, and just as you're watching the video, maybe you answer the questions to yourself. What do you see? How does it relate to race, privilege, implicit bias? Does it show an implicit bias towards or against a particular group? And would you have noticed these inequities if you'd seen them while walking about? So the first one here is a Red Cross poster. So again, the questions are, what do you see in this image? Do you think this image relates to race, privilege, or implicit bias? Do you think it shows an implicit or explicit bias towards or against a group? And if you had seen this photo, would you have noticed inequities? So one of the things that we know in this picture is that for the most part, the children of color are doing things that are not cool. And the white kids, for the most part, are the ones that are doing cool things. So it could be explicit or implicit, depending on how you're understanding the picture. Some people might walk past this, not even notice it, while others, especially I would say children of color, would notice it and would perhaps internalize a sense of, oh, okay, you know, there's an association here. The next picture is an advertisement. It's a lotion. So again, what do you see? Do you think it relates to race, privilege, implicit bias? Do you think it shows an implicit or explicit bias towards or against a particular group? And if you've seen this in a magazine, would you have noticed inequities? So here, what we see is the word civilized, right? Where you have a Black man looking a particular way, and after he's had the lotion, he takes off this mask of a man that doesn't look civilized. So for people of color, especially African-American men, this would be a very racialized picture for them. So just something to think about in our implicit or explicit bias, how we might read an image like this. Next is a Gap Kids advertisement. Again, what do you see? Does it have an image that relates to race, privilege, implicit bias? Do you think it shows an implicit or explicit bias towards or against a particular group? And if you had seen this, would you have noticed inequities? So here we have predominantly white children and one Black child, a Black girl, whose head is being used as an armrest, right? And so here, this could be seen as a bias against African-American children. They might see this and might have a really negative reaction, whereas others, if they're not Black, they might not even see it, right? So here we have another example of implicit or explicit bias towards a person of color. And then lastly is a Vogue magazine cover. This is an actual Vogue cover. It came out maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. It's their exercise magazine image, or yeah. So what do you see this image? Do you think it relates to race, privilege, or implicit bias? Why not? Does it show explicit or implicit bias against or for a particular group? And if you saw it, would you have seen the inequities in this picture? So a lot of people had a huge negative reaction to this picture because it related to a magazine cover that had come out in the 30s depicting a white woman being kind of carried away in sort of like King Kong image, but definitely racialized as a dark-skinned person or creature, if you will, and you can see the similarities between the two. Now, the Vogue editor said that they did not create this image to this, you know, similar to this earlier one, but there's just so much in common that you would think they would have been aware, or at least been more sensitive to how this might have read, particularly to the African-American community. You have this white woman who looks, you know, kind of a damsel in distress, and you've got this angry, aggressive Black man, which fulfills a lot of stereotypes. Again, sort of thinking about implicit or explicit bias in the way that we put forth images and how we interpret them. So I think it might be helpful just to sort of define implicit bias, so you have a general understanding of what we mean by that. See, it's not working. Okay. So to begin, it's the idea that people are much better at recognizing faces like their own, rather than faces that are different than theirs. Go ahead and move this up. And so when we think about racial differences, we call this the other race effect, and almost all people have it. We're sort of socialized into reading faces that are like our own, unless you've been adopted or you're in a mixed race family. Most families, you have this sort of other race effect. So this effect occurs very early and intensifies over time. And so it's only with a class like this or understanding concepts like this where you can reverse that. But if you don't, it just kind of intensifies. We learn what's important over time. This is from a study by Eberhardt on bias. And over time, our brain builds a preference for those faces at the expense of skills needed to recognize others less relevant. These perception skills remodel our brains so that they can operate more efficiently. Our brains are better at processing faces that evoke a sense of familiarity. So as we progress from an infant and onwards, we create these sort of like shortcuts, if you will, including this other race effect, just to be able to operate more efficiently. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing to be creating this sort of scenario where you are unconsciously biased against a particular group. So how do we move then from implicit bias to critical consciousness? I think the first step is really just to slow down our decision-making process and really kind of think about what we're doing and how we're interacting with others. It's really the best way, I think, to undo this work of being socialized into implicit bias. It's just to really just pause, take a beat, really consider what you're thinking about. You may even want to reconsider your reasons for decisions. If you are trying to think through something, well, make sure you rethink it from this angle of implicit bias. Am I preferencing one group or another? Do I need to reconsider the way I'm doing or making this decision? Always question cultural stereotypes. As we know, we're just sort of, in a way, again, trained to think this way. And so it doesn't mean it's right, but it does mean that we need to question it. We need to really kind of deconstruct assumptions that we make, especially of racial or ethnic groups. And really just monitor ourselves for unconscious bias. It's not the easiest thing, but I think if you become more aware of the way that you think and the way that you interact with others, the more you're able to really monitor and think through what you're doing. All right, so that concludes our activity, our sort of video here on implicit bias.